It's really refreshing and breathtaking to see brothers and sisters continue to care for Palestine and continue to do the work that is necessary for the Palestinian movement around the world. And it's especially important to see, the young students, young brothers and sisters are working as hard as possible to raise awareness about the Palestinian cause, because as we all know, what was said constantly in Palestine by the Zionist movement, that the old will die and the young will forget. Basically, that people are the Zionist movement was hoping that the older generation of Palestine will just die because they're getting old, and the young generation will just forget their cause, thinking that Muslims and Arabs and Palestinians and even Christians in that region would kind of forget about the importance of the cause of Palestine, and they will forget their roots and forget Palestine um, as a central cause for that region and as a central cause for Muslims around the world. So I was asked by these amazing brothers to discuss, the Palestinian cause from specifically in the times after the First World War. And I'm going to go through it, but I don't want to go in a historical timeline, meaning that I'm not going to be starting to discuss the issue of Palestine from specific timelines per se. And the reason for that is I think all of us can do a little bit of research online, and we can get a lot of these dates, get a lot of these important events that took place at that time. Instead, I want us to kind of have a discussion about the events that took place from a social-political analysis to better understand the Palestinian the colonization of the land of Palestine from the dynamics of power at that time. Specifically, as we all know, that period of the time, specifically post the First World War, lots of our Muslim lands, specifically in the Middle East, were colonized and occupied by foreign entities, specifically what was called back then Great Britain and France. And as we all know, in 1917, that was the so-called Sykes-Picot agreement between France and Great Britain, deciding to divide the Middle East into different countries and different territories that they would be controlling. And that agreement divided that region into different entities, different lands that were later occupied and colonized by these forces. And the land of Palestine was given to Great Britain, as we all know. And this agreement, or that these incidents or these events that took place, were not isolated from the international context of Western colonialism and Western imperialism. Because as we all know, when the Ottoman Empire kind of collapsed and lost its control over the Middle East, Great Britain was actually not just involved in that process, because as we know, the so-called Arab Revolution led by Sharif Hussein was coordinated and was actually planned and funded and supported by Great Britain. So the so-called Arab Revolution that took place was more of you can say, a coup that was funded and supported by Great Britain, by Western colonialism, to get rid of the Ottomans from that region. And not that at the end of the end of the era of the Ottomans in the Muslim world, especially in the Middle East, was so great, but at the same time, it was a Muslim rule over Muslim land. So even if there are some issues with it, it's still an internal kind of issues that Muslims need to tackle on their own. However, when Great Britain came on board, their main purpose of funding this so-called revolution was to actually take over the land, as we all know, as it happened in 1920, when the official British so-called mandate, but it's mostly colonization of the land of Palestine, took place. So those are the main events that we're going to be starting this discussion. But before we even go there, and before we talk about after 1917 and Sykes-Picot agreement, I think it's very essential for us to understand the history of Zionism in relationship with European colonialism. Because one issue that is always missing from this conversation, when we talk about Palestine and talk about the Israeli occupation of Palestine, is the ignoring the relationship between Zionism as a political movement and Western colonialism. And before I do that, I want to create a distinction and define two different kinds of colonialism. As we all know, colonialism in its classical sense is what happened in India. You have a foreign occupying force, a colonizing force that came from Great Britain, soldiers on the ground. The main purpose of colonizing and occupying India at that time was basically to exploit the area, exploit the region for the political and economic advantage of Great Britain, meaning that you send soldiers on the ground in India in order to benefit the metropolitan. The main purpose was to exploit India, steal its resources, use its cheap labor, use it as a market for the products that were developed in Great Britain, as a way to expand the political and economic influence of Great Britain. So everything that Great Britain was doing in India, as an example of a colony, was to benefit the metropolitan, was to benefit Great Britain back home. So that colony of India was colonized for the mere purpose of economic and political exploitation of that region to benefit the metropolitan back home. And there's another form of colonialism that is called settler colonialism. And settler colonialism is a little bit different than the classic colonialism, because the main purpose of it is not to benefit the metropolitan, but to create a new colony that is controlled by the settlers who came from Europe. And the best example of this in the modern day is the United States of America. As we know, in 1492, so-called America was explored. It was more it was colonized, and a new settler colonial project was created in America, and where you have European settlers coming to America, killing and committing genocide against the natives to take over the land and create it as a new entity, a new colony that is kind of independent from the metropolitan. Yes, until the independence of America from Great Britain, America, the new America, European America, was still kind of had a political submission to Great Britain, but it was its own it was its own entity that has its own sovereignty over the land, meaning the main purpose of colonizing America was not to exploit the land and to send the money and profits back home, but to create a new country, a new nation that will house the settlers that came from Europe. More examples of this are Australia, Canada, and even at one point, South Africa was supposed to be another example that was stopped. And there are different examples in Africa that was there was an attempt by the Germans to create a settler colonial project in Namibia that was also failed at the end of the 19th century. So this is the concept of settler colonialism. And it's very important for us to understand that Palestine and what the Zionist movement is doing in Palestine is a settler colonial project, meaning that European Jews that were kicked out of Europe came to Palestine. They committed genocide against the Palestinians in the land of Palestine, or the indigenous people in this framework, to create a new land, a new entity, a new nation to house them. And Zionism was the political engine for this project. So this is very important for us to understand, in order for us to try to contextualize and to try to understand European support to the Zionist movement that is currently leading the Israeli project in Palestine. So knowing this distinction will help us put things into perspective and help us understand the relationship between Zionism and the settler colonial and colonialism overall. And now, during that time, specifically at the end of the 19th century, specifically in 1892 and after, many of us know this name, which is Herzl. Theodor Herzl was the founder of Zionism, and Zionism was a racist, colonial, and imperialist political ideology that was created to exploit the Jewish identity, to push Jews to go and settle in Palestine. So Zionism, think about it as white supremacy. And the reason why I'm saying think about it as a white supremacy is, if we look at the history of colonialism, there's two concepts that all of us are familiar with. Number one, the white man's burden. Number two, the civilizing mission of France. White man's burden is Great Britain's ideological framework to justify colonialism. Because when Great Britain was colonizing the rest of the world, they were given the illusion that the reason why Great Britain is colonizing the world is because, you know, the global South is barbaric, uncivilized, and it's our duty as white men to go and civilize the world and bring them from their backward cultures into modernity and into a civilized world. Civilizing mission it's a France brand of colonialism. France was thinking in the 19th century that it's also our duty to go colonize the world and civilize these barbaric human beings that need to be civilized because they're barbaric. And many examples of this, of course, obviously, but one that we know and is talked about a lot, which is the case of Egypt, when France started to actively lie to the natives there that I'm bringing you printers, I'm creating print houses, I'm bringing you newspaper, I'm trying to educate you, I'm trying to help you to become more intellectuals. So that was the purpose. And this is why I'm saying Zionism was following that same framework, the framework of we are the enlightened, and we need to go to that region to bring enlightenment and bring modernity into that region. And Herzl, in the book The Jewish State, he did explicitly or implicitly, actually, in the book, but later on he was very explicit about it. He basically said in the book that, and I'm quoting him right now, is the creation of the state of Israel, or a Jewish state as he calls it, in Palestine, will be a rampart of Europe against Asia, an outpost of civilization as opposed to barbarism. So this quote he mentioned in his book, in the Jewish state, he explicitly said that the creation of state of Israel, or a Jewish state in that region, will be a rampart, will be like a gate between Asia and Europe. It will be an outpost for civilization as opposed to barbarism. So he's admitting and he's acknowledging and he's endorsing the colonial framework of dividing the world between a civilized world and a barbaric world that needs to be civilized. This is what Zionism was created upon, the concept of endorsing Western colonialism and imperialism in order for it to justify its inception, in order for it to justify its relationship with the indigenous people of Palestine. Later on, we start learning that Herzl was actually, it was not emailing 1121, but he was sending letters to many of European colonial powers, specifically sending emails again. I'm sorry, sending messages to, for instance, to Joseph Chamberlain, who was, kind of, you can think about him as the Secretary of State back then. He basically, Herzl was asking Chamberlain at that time that the British support to the creation of a Jewish state in Palestine would be a small buffer state against the Ottoman Empire. And why is this important is because you have to understand that Great Britain's plans to colonize the Middle East was very obvious to everybody in Europe. And this is why Herzl and the Zionist movement that led to the creation of the state of Israel was very fully understanding the framework of European colonialism. And they were using specific trigger words in order to convince colonial powers to support the creation of Israel. So here Herzl is literally telling Great Britain that help me create a small buffer state in Israel. Help me become your agent in that region. And Joseph Mas'ad later on says that he's a Palestinian intellectual and a writer. He said that the purpose of Zionism and the creation of State of Israel was to serve two purposes, was to actually get rid of Jews from Europe and turn them into colonial agents in Palestine. Because as we all know, Jews have been persecuted against in Europe for hundreds of years. They've been treated as second-class citizens. They were always prosecuted. They were always mistreated. So it was essential for someone for Europe to get rid of them, as we know in the Spanish Inquisition against Muslims and Jews, to get rid of them in Europe. So imagine getting rid of them from Europe, but also turning them into colonial agents in Palestine. And in 1902, and this is very essential, Herzl, again, the father of Zionism, messaged Cecil Rhodes. He sent him a message, and Cecil Rhodes, for you who don't know, he was a fierce proponent of settler colonialism in Africa. And Rhodes is someone was a fierce, advocate for settler colonialism and for colonialism in Africa. He was one of the monsters of modern day colonizers from Great Britain. And Herzl sent him a letter in 1902 inviting him to invest in the creation of State of Israel. And he messaged sent him a letter, and I'm quoting him here, and he said, "You are being invited to help make history. It doesn't involve Africa, but a piece of Asia Minor. Not Englishmen, but Jews. How then do I happen to turn to you, since this is an out-of-the-way matter for you? How indeed, because it is something colonial." And, excuse me, and Herzl here, as I mentioned earlier, was using specific words to describe the state, to describe State of Israel. And him calling the State of Israel something colonial is basically just admitting that the creation of State of Israel has to be in the same framework of European colonialism, has to be supported by European colonialism, and that it follows the colonial archive of Europe. And I can bring in a lot of different quotes and a lot of different examples of the relationship between the colonial root cause or the colonial roots in basically in Zionism, and utilizing colonial archive in order for them to embark on a journey of settler colonialism in Palestine. Now, understanding this framework of settler colonialism and the idea that Zionism and Israel needed the colonial cover, needed the colonial support from Europe, now it helps us understand the events of 1948, the events of what we call it as Nakba. And the reason why this is very important is I want you to look at the Balfour Declaration. And for you who don't know, Balfour Declaration was a letter that was sent from Arthur James Balfour. He was the United Kingdom's foreign secretary. He sent a letter to Chaim Weizmann, who was one of the founders of State of Israel and Zionism. And he basically, he basically promised him to give him the land of Palestine as a way for European Jews to go create the State of Israel. And I want you to listen to the letter of Balfour. I'm going to read a little bit of it to kind of, again, help us understand the framework of the creation, the State of Israel in Palestine. And Balfour wrote in his memorandum, "In Palestine, we do not propose even to go through the form of consulting the wishes of the present inhabitants of the country. The four great powers are committed to Zionism. And Zionism, listen to this, Zionism, be it right or wrong, good or bad, is rooted in age-long traditions and present needs in future hopes of far profounder import than the desire and the prejudices of the 700 Arabs who now inhabit the ancient land. Now, excuse me, the reason why I read this in the letter is because we are following the tradition of different racial hierarchy that the Western powers have been creating to justify colonialism in the rest of the world. And here it's very important to say that Balfour is explicitly admitting that he doesn't care whether Zionism is good or bad. He doesn't care whether the creation of State of Israel is good or bad. He doesn't even care about the desires and the hopes and the aspiration of the 700,000 indigenous people of Palestine. All he cares about, and he made it very clear, that Zionism is going to be helping the interests of the Great Britain in the region, and because of that, Great Britain is going to support Zionism to create their state in Palestine in order for the interests of the United Kingdom to be protected in that region. He's literally saying that the 700,000 indigenous people of Palestine, they can be ethnic cleansed. Genocide can be committed against them as far as Zionism can actually benefit United Kingdom. And this is the root cause of, not the root cause, but this is kind of goes in hand with what I talked about before, which is the concept of white supremacy, Zionism, a civilizing mission, and the white man burden. Because we create a racial hierarchy that is very important in colonialism and settler colonialism. Because now Zionism is following the ethos of European civilizing mission in 19th century that was established on racist, supremacist, and utilitarian principles, where now Europeans and Zionists, they believe that they are better than the indigenous people of Palestine, and as such, they deserve the land, and these barbarics do not deserve to live in that land. Now, this racial hierarchy that was prominent in the Zionist movement, and it was prominent in European colonialism, was used or was summarized in an amazing book called "The Colonizer and the Colonized" by Albert Mim, who's an expert in settler colonialism. He summarized the colonial system formula as follows. He is saying that colonial racism, which is again, we cannot admit, and this is where Edward Said becomes very important, because when we talk about Orientalism, the concept of Orientalism is not just the fear of the other, it's not just the ignorance of the other. Orientalism is important to create an ideology, a racial ideology, a racial hierarchy for the colonizer to justify their oppression and their genocide against the colonized. This is a system, brothers and sisters. It's not just a belief that I'm better than you. It's a system that is created to justify genocide and to teach the children for the future that we are better than everybody else. We deserve to rule the world. And in order for us to continue our supremacy, we have to engage in genocide, and we have to engage in oppression and systematic oppression, systematic racism against them. So Albert Mime says in the book, The Colonized and Colonizer, and he summarizes the colonial racism, and he said that it's built on three major ideological components, okay? Ideological components are essential. One, you have to create a gulf between the culture of the colonized and the colonizer. You have to create a division, meaning you separate them, two different cultures. Then, number two, you exploit these differences for the benefit of the colonizer. So first, you create a difference. You need to create an image or a binary or a dichotomy that there is a culture for the colonizer, for Europeans, and there's a culture for the global South. And later on, you need to exploit that difference in the benefit of the colonizer. And finally, use these supposed difference as standards of absolute facts. And this is a system. So Europeans say their culture is different than the global South culture. Then they go second step. Our culture is better because it's more civilized, it's enlightened, it follows different rules. And finally, you make absolute facts. European values are better than everybody else. Once you say that, Europeans have every justification in their heads, or and they tell everybody this, that now we're better, our values are better. Now it's very important for us to spread these values around the world. And this is the concept of globalization, and this is the concept of new liberalism and new imperialism and new colonialism that we live in today. That America is engaged by Hollywood and different frameworks and different examples of changing the world to follow American ethos and and the so-called American dream. So this racism and this racial hierarchy was essential for Zionism to start involving itself in something that we call the ethnic cleansing of Palestine. And the ethnic cleansing of Palestine, as Ilan Pappé, who's an Israeli thinker and a writer, and he talked about this in his book, The Ethnic Cleansing of Palestine. So it's essential for for Zionism as a racist ideology to endorse this framework, this racial hierarchy of colonialism, in order to do what? When we talked about settler colonialism at the very beginning of the conversation, we talked that there's a difference between settler colonialism and classic colonialism, because classic colonialism, and I'm going to summarize again, is the political and economic subordination of the indigenous people in favor to benefit the metropolitan. But settler colonialism is the permanent appropriation of the land, is the stealing, is taking over the land in order to bring in a new settlers to that land. And the only way for you to permanently appropriate a land, you have to do what? You have to eliminate the indigenous people. And this is what happened in America. Millions of natives were ethnically cleansed, were eliminated by genocide in order to create room for Europeans to come over and take over the land. And what do we have in America today? We have European settlers who came and took over the land, and now America, the majority of it are European settlers. Of course, now we have blacks and Latinos. Things are changing, but the land is still controlled by European whites who came here, committed genocide against natives, and took over the land. Now, as I mentioned, this systematic approach of invading the land and to destroy the structure of the land is not something incidental. As Wolf, who's another expert in settler colonialism, he said that settler colonialism destroys to replace. And guess what's funny? What's ironic, actually, not funny. Herzl, in his book, the one I talked about in the late 19th century, he wrote his book, The Jewish State, and he said, if I wish to substitute a new building for an old one, I must demolish before I construct. So now, settler colonialism today, they talk about the concept of settler colonialism is you must destroy to replace, but Herzl understood this. And this is why I'm saying this is very important to us to understand beyond the concept of just going through the timeline of history, is that Herzl himself understood that in order for him and for Zionism to create the state of Israel, they must engage in a settler colonial project to eliminate the indigenous people, to create room for European Jews to come to Palestine, to occupy the land of Palestine. And this can be done only through two things, as we know in settler colonialism. Number one, the erasure of the identity, the culture, the history, the civilization of the indigenous people of the land. And number two, by eliminating them physically from the land. And this is what we're seeing and what we saw in 1948. We saw the expulsion of 700,000 Palestinians out of their homes and kicking them out of the land of Palestine to create room for European settlers. But number two, which is an ongoing process until today, which is the systematic erasure of the Muslim and Christian culture and history in Jerusalem, what we know today as the Judaization project of Jerusalem. the idea of erasing the Muslim and Christian identity of Jerusalem and replacing it with a modern Jewish identity in order for the Jewish or Zionist state of Israel to continue its path of settler colonialism, which is the elimination of the indigenous people. And as we know, the elimination cannot be done without creating racial structures in place and racial hierarchy that that relegate the indigenous people of Palestine to subclass citizens and relegate them to subhumans that can be eliminated by power, by erasure, by ethnic cleansing, by expulsion from the land. This is the state of Israel, and this is what we have today. So I want to stop here because I want to hopefully maybe answer some questions instead of continuing on this on just talking about it. But I wanted to highlight this feature and the root cause of Zionism for us to understand what we're facing today. Because what we're facing today is not just a simple occupation where you have one nation fighting with another nation and they took over part of that land and there's a fight over that that piece of land. They both are claiming ownership over that land. No, it's not like that. That's a simple way of putting it. Zionism in Israel is a settler colonial project that came to the land of Palestine with the support of colonial powers to eliminate the indigenous people of land and replace them with European settlers who came from Europe to become agents for European colonialism in the region. So I'll stop here and I will go back to Said and see if there's any conversation, any questions or conversations. Look, there's two ways to look at this. Number one, the concept of using history to justify the creation of Jewish states on the land of Palestine. There's many ways to refute this, and there's a lot of historic proof that even from an Islamic perspective, the Jewish tribes that lived in Palestine never lasted more than 70 years in the land of Palestine. Even you can go as back as thousands of years, and even if the case that Jews were actually living in Palestine for thousands of years before, and historically things changed, right? What we're facing, what we are facing today is not an authentic way for descendants of that land to come and take over the land. As the reason why I mentioned what I mentioned today and when I talked about settler colonialism is it's very important to understand the root cause of this movement. The Zionist movement was not religious at all. As a matter of fact, and I can bring in many examples here. Zionist leaders were making fun of Jewish traditions. For example, Haim Weizmann, who was again the founder of the State of Israel, was actually baiting the rabbis about kosher food. He was actually having fun and making fun of rabbis and tell them that the food is kosher, and then once they eat it, he would laugh at them and tell them, "Oh, that was not kosher." So there's Zionist thinkers like Jacob Klatskin, who used religious rhetoric to recruit masses in East European Jews who tend to be religious. He argued that we must use religious rhetoric to recruit East European Jews. There are many of them who, for instance, Max Nordau, who said we need to strengthen the collective feeling because the religion can be used as a source of potential reconstructive energy. So the idea was that the Jewish identity for the Zionist movement was not essential. And Herzl, in his book, The Jewish State, he made it clear that when we want to create the land of the Jewish state, it must be done on based on scientific principles. He said that we need to, the creation of the country needs to be done by means of every modern experience, like or sciences. And he talked and goal of even Leon Punkster, who was a famous intellectual of Zionism, he said that the Zionist project must not be the Holy Land, but a land of their own. And if you know that Herzl himself initially, projected or suggested a project to be in Uganda in Africa, and some projects were suggested in Argentina, Latin America. So the idea was that current a modern day Zionist project was not done to restore the claimed Jewish lost identity in the land of Palestine. It was created based on principles of settler colonialism. And this is essential for us to go. And to be honest with you, for me as a Palestinian and someone who works for Palestine, I really don't care whether you lived here thousands of years ago or not. What I care about is how did you come to our land and how did you commit genocide against the indigenous people of Palestine? Meaning, imagine right now Muslims declare war on Spain and say, listen, hundreds of years ago, Muslims lived in southern Spain, and now I'm going to commit genocide against the people who live in southern Spain now, and I'm going to take over that land because that land belongs to me. Like, imagine someone say something like that. They will remotely closer to that. It will be a nightmare for everybody. Like, people will declare war on Muslims, right? It will be like a global war against Muslims. So history at this point, for me at least, of course, there's a lot of historians will refute a lot of these narratives and a lot of these claims, because a lot of these claims are not historically accurate. But even if they're accurate, right, that does not justify the settler colonial project of Zionism that used Jewishness as a recruitment means to Eastern Jews. And if you actually, if you actually look at the colonial racism that we talked about, even Eastern Jews were made fun of. Let me give you some examples of Arthur Ruppin, who was a prominent Zionist thinker who attributed Jews to white race. And he said that Oriental Jews who migrate to Palestine are not on the same intellectual and spiritual status as Western European Jews. This is one of the prominent Zionist thinkers who used to think that Oriental Jews are, like, he called them like very similar to Arabs. They're like lazy and then they don't work enough, and the spiritual intellectual status is below. It will actually, look what he says, say that the spiritual and intellectual status is so low of the Oriental Jews, is so low that an immigrant in mass would lower the general cultural standard of Jews in Palestine and would be bad for several points of view. Like, he also said, Ashkenazis are superior in activity, intelligence, and scientific capacity to Arabian Jews because only the cleverest and strongest survived the oppression they faced in Europe of decades. So here you have a Zionist thinker invoking social Darwinism, the idea that only the fittest of humans should be leading because they're following Darwinism, but they call it social Darwinism because it's based on racism, that whites are better than everybody else and everybody should just follow their lead. So you have Zionist thinkers are explicitly telling you that Arab and Oriental and Eastern European Jews are lesser class than white Jews from Europe. So clearly the project was not created to restore that Jewish identity that was so-called lost in Palestine. It was built on settler colonial project. But finally, from an Islamic perspective, even if history proves that claim, and again, even if it does, settler colonialism is not justified because of that. But Islamically speaking, we as Muslims, that land belongs to us. Once the land belongs to us, we believe that Judaism, Christianity were religions that were sent by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And we believe that Islam is an extension of these religions. And we believe that was these people back then who believed in Allah were Muslims. So they are our people too. So we believe we're descendants of these people and this land belongs to us as well. So even from a religious perspective, we also have a claim that this land also belongs to us because these people were also Muslims, because we believe in Yahudiya and we believe in Christianity, that they are religions that were sent by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and we believe these people were our brothers and sisters because they were truly Muslims back then. It just a different sets of rules before Sayyidina Muhammad was sent. So again, these claims can be easily refuted. So, unfortunately, uh, and especially in the West, we gotta acknowledge, we gotta understand who owns knowledge. Unfortunately, the the intellectuals who migrated to the U.S. And Europe overall and Western world, for the most part, were seculars. Were secular Arabs who came here, who created that knowledge. The epistemology of the Palestinian cause was created from a secular sense, unfortunately. And that's something Muslims and Islamists have failed at, which is creating an epistemology that reflects the truth and reflects the true history. If you go back in time, and you go back in the early 20th century, after the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, the majority of the resistance movement against Ottoman Empire and against the early stages of Zionism were led by Muslims. And by Muslims, I don't mean just the majority of Palestinians are Muslims, but actually Muslim movements. Like for instance, as we know, Izzuddin al-Qassam was a Syrian imam who migrated to Palestine and led a revolution against British occupation of Palestine. Al-Husseini, Abdul Qadir al-Husseini was also an Islamist. Amin al-Husseini was an Islamist. Abdul Qadir was also an Islamist. The Muslim movements in Palestine and the declaration of resistance against foreign occupation was declared from manabir of mosques. But the concept of current modern day Islamic movements was not present back then. We talk about 1920s and 1910s and 30s. There's no concept of Islamic movement in the sense that we know it today. So when people used to fight, the word jihad was used. And when we say a word jihad, it means that people are fighting from their Islamic value of having to defend their land. So, unfortunately, many scholars who report on that history just use the word Arab as a way to describe these resistance movements and these uprisings without acknowledging the ideology behind it. I want to give a small example here because it's very essential. One of the very prominent intellectuals when it comes to decolonization was someone who's very very known, Frantz Fanon, and he's someone who's amazing, and I urge all people to read him, read his books, especially The Rich of the Earth. When he talked about the Mujahideen and the resistance fighters in Algeria, he never ever mentioned the ideology of Islam as the engine or the ideology for the resistance fighters and the Mujahideen in Algeria to defend against the French in Algeria. And he was criticized for that. The fact that he ignored a very essential component of the ideology of the Mujahideen in Algeria that led them to fight back against French colonization of Algeria. So what I'm trying to say, and I don't know if it's intentional, but the idea is that decolonization intellectuals and writers who are people who supported us and who wrote extensively against settler colonialism and colonialism overall, ignored the Islamic perspective and ignored the Islamic ideology of the masses when it comes to rejecting and resisting against foreign occupation. So unfortunately, sometimes it's intentional and sometimes it's not. However, if you fast forward from the 20s and 30s and 40s and all the way to the late 50s and 60s, you have to understand also that the polarization of the United States of America and the former Soviet Union, the idea of the Cold War meant that both Soviet Union and America were investing in creating movements and masses and leadership that support the political polarization between these former enemies in the Cold War. Russia invested heavily in the Middle East under the slogans of fighting colonialism and fighting imperialism. And a lot of Arabs endorsed that rhetoric, and they thought that the only way for us to fight American imperialism in the region, the only way for us to fight settler colonialism in Palestine is to endorse the Soviet Union socialist and communist claims in that region as the only way to fight American imperialism. And that's what happened. And this is why, for instance, a PFLP, which is a Marxist movement, was created in the 60s, following the support of the Soviet Union financially, morally, intellectually, epistemologically, as a way to fight American imperialism. And I want to say here that the best way was to unpack American imperialism and capitalism at that time was Marxism. That's something we have to admit, that it's something to use as a tool for us to understand it. However, the tool is different than the framework of analysis. Yes, Marxism can be used to define and unpack capitalism and imperialism. However, we as Muslims believe that Islam has the solution to resist and fight back against European imperialism against our region. So the claims that Islamists or Muslims did not fight for Palestine is absolutely false. And people who hide this truth are usually not interested in giving any credit to Muslims or to give any credit to Islamists who've led the war, led the resistance against British colonialization and colonialism in Palestine since 1910s all the way to today. And the claim that unfortunately people like Mahdi Hassan endorse against Hamas, that the Islamic movement was created by Israel, it's just laughable to say the least. I wrote an article in this, and maybe Sayyid can post it in the group and he shared it with others. But I went through history explaining the falsehood of that claim, even though, as I mentioned, like it's laughable, but it's good for us to understand historically that claim is just inaccurate, and it was used as a propaganda tool against Hamas when it was created by their rivals in the Palestinian political arena by Fatah and other secularists to undermine the Islamic movement. And unfortunately, until today, some of these people who claim to defend Palestine are using that framework to demonize Hamas, as if Hamas is something isolated from the Palestinian people. That's kind of, in summary, a short answer, not too short, to the question. Look, we have to be honest. When we talk about the root cause of the Palestinian question, we already said that it's a settler colonial project, meaning that the project of settler colonialism, the project of Zionism, is to destroy is to destroy the narrative, the history, the culture of the natives in that country, and replace it with a Zionist one that came from Europe and that was supported for Europe. So the only way to resist against settler colonialism, and that's not something I'm saying, that's it's not something that I came up with. It's literally the answer by every single settler colonial expert who wrote on the subject matter, that the only way for settler colonialism to end is to reverse the outcome and the result of the settler colonial project. Just like Herzl mentioned that in order for the Jewish state to be created on the land of Palestine, they need to demolish Palestine to create the state of Israel. And the only way for us to free Palestine is to destroy the settler colonial project and to eliminate the settler colonial project. There's no other way. The other, and this is what Frantz Fanon talked about, that you cannot decolonize by making peace with the colonizers. You just have to reverse the outcome of the settler colonial project. So the ideas of one state, two state, they're only dealing with the outcome of settler colonialism, but not dealing with the root cause of the question. So the only solution for the Palestine, the way Palestinians see it, is for Palestine to be free from the river to the sea, is for settler colonialism to end, and for Palestinians to get back their land, and for the refugees to go back to their country. That's the only reasonable solution for Palestinians. Everything else is, just to be honest, just a waste of time, because Israel as a colonial project will never accept peace, because that goes against its essence. Like, the only way for Israel to continue is to continue its settler colonial project. And settler colonial project, as I described and I explained, is not something that can be stopped, because once you stop your settler colonial project, you're basically shooting yourself in the foot. You're ceasing to exist, because the only way for you to exist is to continue your genocide against the indigenous people of Palestine. Well, as I explained before, the Jewish state was created by European Jews and led by white Western European Jews that were in bed with colonialism. So to them, it doesn't. They don't care. So you gotta understand, when the West has pushing for secularism, it's not pushing for secularism because they don't like religion. It's more that they want the nation state to be on top of religion. They want the rule of the nation state to transcend the metaphysical gods, meaning that Europeans think, I don't care if you believe in anything, as long as nation state comes first, you can believe in whatever you want. As long as your God, your religion, your ideology doesn't make you challenge the nation state rule and tyranny, you can believe in whatever they want. So as long as, and this is what Joseph Mas'ad mentioned, as long as the Jewish state serves the interests of colonial powers, they don't care what happens inside. They don't care what the nation state believes in. So this rhetoric that we see nowadays, or what we hear nowadays, it just PR. It's just a concept of many scholars say that the utilization of modern day talking points to justify colonialism. Because we have to admit that once colonialism has ended in the last century in its classical terms, meaning that when colonial powers were not able to continue their foot on the ground colonization of these countries, they realized they have to form a new form of colonialism, and this is what we know today as a new colonialism, is to use these new ideologies, these liberal ideologies about human rights and about minority rights and women rights, and nowadays the concept of sexual and gender identity rights, using all of this to justify colonialism. And as we know, an example of this is when we talk about the invasion and occupation of Afghanistan, there was something called feminist colonialism or feminist imperialism, where feminism is used as a way to justify the occupation of Afghanistan. When Bush and others say, "Oh, Afghanis oppress their women, so we need to go and liberate these women." So again, Europe uses anything to justify occupation. So to them, there is everything, and this is what we know nowadays about like the concepts of modernity and post-modernity, is using any value, any truth in order to justify colonialism and imperialism. So let's not take anything that the West is producing as the truth, capital T, but more of using liberal rights in order to legitimize and justify imperialism. Yeah, as I mentioned earlier, in order for settler colonialism to succeed, you have to, as I mentioned, like I mentioned two things explicitly. There's two things you must do: erase the culture and identity of the indigenous people in order for you to justify the genocide against them. If you come and say there is no history of Muslims and Christians in Palestine, and these like you have to understand the talking point of Zionism when they say a land without people for people without a land, meaning that Palestine was empty and European Jews migrated there to create their country. So in order for you to justify that, in order for you to legitimize that code, because this is very important for us, you have to create the illusion that these so-called Palestinians have no history in Palestine. Like many of the Zionists right now and Israelis say, oh, Palestinians are Arabs. There's no such thing as Palestine. There is no history in Palestine that belongs to these indigenous people. This is important. And the reason why they say it, they're not saying it just because they hate us. They say it because it's a systematic process. In order for you to justify the creation of a settler colonial project on the land of Palestine, on the rubble and the bodies and the genocide of Palestinians, you have to say, you have to justify it by saying there is no culture and history that existed there. And what proves our culture and history in Palestine more than Al-Aqsa Mosque? Al-Aqsa Mosque was built thousands of years ago. So if you destroy Al-Aqsa Mosque, you go to the world and say, listen, there is nothing proves that Islam ever even existed in this land. Nothing proves the Muslims claim that this land belongs to them for thousands of years. This land was empty and we came to take it over. If you don't believe us, come check it out. There's nothing in Palestine. As a matter of fact, they might start telling you, this sounds laughable, but knowing Zionists, and they would do it. They will start saying, oh, these photos that you have of Al-Aqsa Mosque are Photoshop. There's no such thing as Al-Aqsa Mosque. I know I'm exaggerating right now in this concept because it's not as easy as that. I mean, most people are not going to believe them. But the idea, again, is to destroy the culture, the identity, the history of the indigenous people is essential to justify their genocide. This is what happened when Europeans came to America. To deny the culture and history of the indigenous people of this land was essential to justify genocide against them. Let's take a look at all of the movies that talked about the natives of this country, right? Correct me if I'm wrong, anybody. Did we ever watch a movie about the natives in this land? They call them Native Americans or whatever they call them. Did we ever see them in any light, with the exception of them being barbaric, violent, uneducated, are not able to speak, and just attacking white people for no reason? This is how we see them. This is how natives of this country are portrayed in media. And the reason why they're portrayed that way, even though genocide has been committed against them for hundreds of years now, and it's done deal, there's no coming back from it. It's very important for this to appease the or to distort the history of this land, to keep putting it in the consciousness or the subconscious of people that, you know, these people deserved to be killed. Genocide was the only reason for us to protect the world against these barbaric people who need to be eradicated and eliminated for us to bring in modernity and to bring in civilization into this land. So this is exactly what Israel is doing. It's trying to erase that history. It's trying to erase that culture in order for it to justify its existence in that region. This is ABC of settler colonialism. So this is a very old propaganda tool by Zionism, is to use anti-Zionism or the fight against settler colonialism in Palestine with anti-Semitism. The reason for this is we got to admit, and we have to be honest with ourselves. Jews in Europe have faced prosecution, racism, supremacy, hatred for hundreds of years. This is a fact. And this actually what drove the Zionist movement to use European anti-Semitism to recruit Jews to migrate to Palestine. Because Jews suffered so much in Europe that the appeal to create their own state, to protect themselves, was very appealing to everybody. And unfortunately, that fear and that history was used to drive genocide against the native people of Palestine, unfortunately. And we cannot deny that Jews faced Holocaust in Germany. This is a fact, and we cannot deny it. Muslims have to be very vocal against this. And we have to distinguish between the victims of European anti-Semitism and the Zionist leaders who used and exploited these horrific acts that happened in Europe to justify the genocide against the indigenous people and the creation of the Select Colonial Project in Palestine. This has to be very clear. Now, the problem is Zionism is also now comparing the Muslim rejection of the creation of the settler colonial project of Israel in Palestine as a way of anti-Semitism. They're claiming and using that propaganda talking points to appease the European sensibilities against anti-Semitism. Because as we know, after the Holocaust, Europe took a step back and said, listen, we just got to admit that, Europeans committed genocide against Jews. And we just have to admit now, moving forward, especially after the creation of Israel, that we just have to admit that we were wrong. We were anti-Semitic. We were extremely bad against Jews. Now we have to fight against anti-Semitism. So the Zionist movement used that to compare any rejection of their project in Palestine, to compare it and conflate it with anti-Semitism, to exploit Europeans' anti-Semitism campaigns to claim that we are all anti-Semitic, that we are fighting Israelis and Zionists because they're Jews. And this is further from the truth, because as we know, while Jews were prosecuted in Europe, they were living in peace in the Muslim world. They were living in peace in the Arab world. And the only time where the clashes started erupting between Muslims, Christians, and Jews in the region was after British colonialism and after the project of Zionism have kicked off in the end of the 19th century, when it was very obvious that Zionist project is coming to Palestine to take over the land and use Jewishness to exploit or to carry on the Zionist project in Palestine. So rejecting the state of Israel and rejecting Zionism is not anti-Semitism. And even, let's be very frank, even if Muslims refer to Israelis and Zionists as Jews, it's not from the background of hatred to Jews. It's just not true. Historically speaking, there has not been an anti-Semitism campaign or project in Muslim world ever, like the way we've seen it in Europe, right? We're not going to admit that, yes, historically there might be issues here and there, as always we know with minorities anywhere they live in the world. There's always an issue of the otherization, and sometimes, unfortunately, people abuse them without a doubt. But it was never, ever, ever done in the way that how Jews were treated in Europe and the genocide they've witnessed in the Spanish Inquisition all the way to the Holocaust. This is a reality. So now, because we live at least me and others are living in the Western world, it's very easy for the Zionist movement to accuse Muslims of being anti-Semitic, because Europeans understand what anti-Semitism, and they understand that also the global South and Muslims, because of Orientalism, are barbarics, because until now, the West thinks Muslims and the global South are barbaric and they need to be civilized. So it's easy for them to accept that these barbaric are anti-Semitic and they hate Jews for being Jews. And unfortunately, there's a lot of things that are taken out of context from Islam in order for them to justify and legitimize that point of anti-Semitism. But it's very clear. Our issue is with the people, with the colonizers, the people who are currently occupying and colonizing the land of Palestine. Whether they call themselves Jews, Muslims, Christians, atheists, whatever they call themselves, our issue is with them for occupying our land. And that's it. Now, it happens that they are Jews and we are Muslims. The majority of us are Muslims, but there's a lot of Christian Palestinians. There's even Jewish Palestinians. The majority of us are Muslims. It just happens that we are the indigenous people of Palestine are Muslims, and the colonizers happen to be Jews, and they call themselves Jews. However you want to look at it. So the relationship here is solely and all explicitly between a colonizer and a colonized. If the colonizer called themselves Jews, and when the colonized refer to their colonizers as Jews, they don't do it because they hate Jews, but because this is how the colonizers define themselves, as Jews. So when we refer to them as Jews, we don't refer them to them as Jews because we hate them or we hate Jews. It's just that That's the reality on the ground. So this is what we need to understand, and we have to be vocal about it, because unfortunately Zionism is exploiting the concept of anti-Semitism in Europe to undermine us and to attack us in order to gain to undermine the momentum that we're building now for the Palestinian cause in Europe. Well, I mean, it's very simple. Europe and the West overall is still engaged in imperialism, and it's very important for them to continue to have economic and political hegemony in the Muslim world. So it's very important for them, just following classic colonialism of always creating a division between the so-called civilized and uncivilized. So why would they shoot themselves in the foot? If you fight Islamophobia, then you're fighting yourselves because an empire like America cannot continue unless you keep convincing your own population that you are invading Iraq because they need civilization. How many times did Bush and Obama and others say, "Oh, we are invading Iraq, or we are in Iraq because we want to bring about democracy"? So when you say that, you're indirectly, actually, you are explicitly saying the Iraqis don't know how to create democracy, and they are uncivilized, and it's our job to go there and civilize them and bring them democracy. So it serves their interests. Why would they end it? It just makes no sense. Yeah, I mean, Nazism, as many scholars mention, it's only um, they argued that Nazism was the only um, it, what's the word they used? It's the last reasonable or the last expected um, outcome of hundreds of years of anti-Semitism in Europe. When you look at 1492, the Spanish Inquisition, the concept of the purity of blood and faith, right? Europe believes that the only true Europeans have to be white and have to be Christian. Now, anybody who's not white or Christian is automatically relegated to subhuman. And Jews have faced that for hundreds of years. And again, the only reason why Europe supported Zionism and Jews to create a state of Israel, as I mentioned earlier, was to turn them into colonial agents, as Joseph Massad mentions, right? So it's very clear the support of Israel was not because they like Jews. It was literally a utilitarian move to use them to continue their imperialism in the region. It's that simple. So why would they end their hatred against the Jews if they still need the concept of purity and blood, purity of blood and faith, the concept of white man is still better than everybody else, and everybody else need to to be subordinate to the white man in order for them to continue their imperialism. So the Holocaust kind of woke them up a little bit because it was so evil that it was hard for them to continue from there. And this is why things are changing. But until today, there's a lot of internalized anti-Semitism that doesn't come out that much because now the interest of Europe is with the interest of Israel. So it's very essential now to fight anti-Semitism in Europe because they need to defend Israel, and they are conflating some, anti-Semitism with anti-Israel because it serves their purpose. So, as we talked about when we talk about Orientalism and we talked about white supremacy, as I mentioned earlier, the racial hierarchy is important for colonialism and imperialism in order for it to continue and to stay in power. Well, UAE unfortunately is being a stooge to Western powers. Their rulers are in bed with American imperialism, and they're serving their interests in the region. So it's just a classic native collaborator who, after the concept of decolonization, not decolonization, but the independence movement in the last century, Europe decided that instead of having boots on the ground, instead of having the soldiers on the ground, they will have a new form of colonialism, which is the indirect one, by having political and economic hegemony and domination over that region. So these guys are just collaborators, and they serve the Western power. And historically, we had many of these people in Muslim consciousness. So unfortunately, they're rulers who are just puppets and agents to the West against our own people. So for them to collaborate with Israel is just only expected, because that's their job. They were created and they were put in power, and they were supported to continue the interest of the West in our region, to continue to divide it and to continue to have political hegemony there. Of course, absolutely. Brothers, I'm gonna be very, very blunt here, and I'm only saying this because I'm from Middle East. I was born and raised there, so I understand where you come from. But we have to be honest with ourselves, and this is where some of these Western propaganda talking points come from, because we are oppressed so much that, and we cannot comprehend that the colonizers of Palestine, some of them are victims of the Holocaust. Some of us think, and back home, how can someone who is a victim of the Holocaust come and do something very similar to the Holocaust to our brothers and sisters in Palestine? So let's not allow, and unfortunately, there's a lot of anti-Semitism that came from Europe, kind of seeped into our movements back home to rally the people ideologically against the colonizers. But we really don't need to do that. We should not allow this to happen. The Holocaust happened. It's wrong fundamentally. There is no even question about it. We should be very vocal about it. And as a matter of fact, us speaking up against the Holocaust is actually important for us. Why? Not because I need to defend myself that I'm not anti-Semitic, but to prove that Europe, as a colonial power, was directly involved in the genocide against the same people they supported to create the state of Israel. And this proves that Europe has no moral compass. They would commit a genocide against people. A few years later, they will support them to commit genocide against other people. And that's what colonialism is about. This is what imperialism is about. This is what white supremacy is about. So let's not fall into the traps of us trying to dehumanize our enemies by denying a historical fact. I'm all for dehumanizing our enemies. Our enemies are our enemies. These are our colonizers. But let's not ignore history and a fact just because we are we're still grieving because as an outcome of the settler colonial project in Palestine. The two have nothing to do with each other. We can both say the Holocaust happened and is a terrible thing by European colonial powers, but at the same time say, unfortunately, some of the victims of the Holocaust came themselves and committed something similar to the Holocaust in Palestine. There is nothing for us to say that. They're not mutually exclusive. So let's not deny history. Let's not fall into this anti-Semitic propaganda that comes from Europe. And this propaganda that, oh, the Jews deserved what happened to them in the Holocaust because this and that. This is all nonsense, brothers and sisters. This is not something we should allow. This is something we have to fight against in our movements. What happened to to Jews in Europe is wrong. And if we justify it, then we justify the colonization of Europeans against Indians. We justify the French colonialism and the 1 million martyrs in Algeria. Because France will say, oh, these people who fought against us are barbaric and uncivilized. They deserve to die. If we cannot justify that and we are fighting against it, then how can we justify the oppression against Jews in Europe? We cannot do that. We have to be consistent. This is us. There's nothing to hide. We are consistent. Europeans were anti-Semitic. They committed genocide against the Jews, and they committed genocide against our people. And the two are not mutually exclusive. On the contrary, when we are consistent about our critique to European colonialism, we are consistent with our critique to settler colonialism in Palestine. That we have nothing against the Jews. We have a problem with Zionists using Judaism and Jewishness to create a violent project in Palestine. This is very essential, and this is something we have to work on to make sure. Not, by the way, not just to defend ourselves and not worry about the West. I'm only worried about our own intellectual. What's the? We have to work. We have to care about our own intellectualism. We have to care about the accuracy of history to keep in our consciousness that we're not going to Allah. We're not okay with oppression anywhere. We have to be consistent. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, وَلَا تَزِرُ وِزْرَةٌ وِزْرَ أُخْرَى, that one issue should not be conflated with another issue. We are against oppression against anybody. And Jews faced oppression in Europe. This is a fact. We just cannot deny it because we're hurt of what's happening in Palestine. This is something should be completely rejected. No, I mean, look, as long as mainstream media is still supporting Israel and standing with Israel all the way, it's very hard to change the general population's outlook on the issue. It's not as easy as we think. And we have to understand that even if the general public stand with Palestine, that's not enough. Because the American administration, the Pentagon, the foreign policy of America was created to support Israel because, as Noam Chomsky mentions, Israel is a client state. It means that Israel's existence guarantees American political hegemony in the Middle East. So the Pentagon and American imperialism and the empire is not going to stop supporting Israel unless supporting Israel becomes more costly to America than not supporting it. And that doesn't happen by public pressure only. That happens by different actors in the region making it difficult for America to continue to support Israel. So yes, the general public is important. We have to keep educating them because eventually we'll reach that point, inshallah. But we need power. And the only power we have right now is resistance, and that's the only way for Palestinians to be able to decolonize against the settler colonial project in Palestine. The least we should do is to continue the education, to not just expose Israel, but to expose American complicit partnership in the settler colonial project in Palestine, to eventually, hopefully, lead America and other colonial powers to stop blindly, not blindly because it's not really blind support, is actually a partnership in suppressing that region. And this is essential for us to mention. And this is why, again, the reason why I emphasize on the colonial aspect of Israel is to also help us understand the relationship between Israel and the West. That it's not Israel does without the support of colonial powers cannot exist. As simple as that. But the West is interested in maintaining Israel because it supports them. It supports their interest and it maintains their interest in the region. So we have to take that into account whenever we talk about how we can end the colonial project in Palestine. Very good question, especially that I'm talking to brothers and sisters that are in the Ummah, in the Muslim world. From our perspective in that region is different than the West, right? I think the best way for you to be able to help Palestine is to continue to place Palestine in the consciousness of our Muslim brothers and sisters everywhere in the world. It's very important to continue to give Palestine the priority it deserves. And I don't want to sound selfish here, but the Palestinian cause should, and it is the central cause for Muslims. And I'm not saying this because I'm a Palestinian. And I'm not only saying this because Al-Aqsa is the third holiest mosque in Islam. I'm not only saying this because Palestine is a Muslim land, because Kashmir is also a Muslim land. And Kashmir is under occupation right now. Many Muslim lands are under occupation that deserve our focus. But without the freedom of Palestine, Muslims will continue to be subordinate to Western powers. Israel is a microcosm of European imperialism. Israel is an extension of American imperialism, American colonialism, and European capitalism. And when Israel continues to oppress our people and continues to maintain the social, the political, and economic hegemony of the West in the region, the Muslim world will continue to suffer. The Muslim world will continue to have leaders who are stooges to the West. The Muslim world will continue to be suppressed. The Muslim world will continue to be not united. So our I'm being very frank. Our only hopes, our only method, our only way to achieve the Muslim unity, to achieve Muslim excellence, to achieve Muslim, as they call, quote unquote, salvation, on what Islam, what we call it as falah. The only way for us as Muslims to thrive and to bring back the true message of Islam to the world, because we know Islam is universal and it's our message to spread justice everywhere in the world and peace. The only way to do it is through the liberation of Palestine, because the occupation of Palestine resembles the superiority and the political hegemony of the West over the Muslim land. So we cannot ever be united. Muslims cannot be independent. They cannot be liberated while Israel is a cancer that still lives in the heart of the Muslim ummah. This is the reality. And I'm not saying this out of just passion of being a Palestinian or a Muslim who cares about a Muslim land. But if you look at it from purely political and economic analysis of the region, you cannot thrive as a Muslim ummah while Israel exists in the heart of the Muslim ummah, while that cancer is still eating up our ummah, destroying our region, killing our brothers and sisters, destroying our Muslim sites, trying to erase our culture and our history. We cannot do it. When we have a microcosm of European evil in our region, you cannot thrive as an ummah. And this is what I'm saying. Palestine is a central cause for Muslims. So I invite all of you to continue to educate the masses, to continue to work for the cause of Palestine. Every locality is different. So what applies in the West doesn't apply to you. So I don't want to advise you in something that I'm not familiar with. So I think you on the ground know what's best to support the brothers and sisters in Palestine and to support the Palestinian cause. But having conversations like this, raising awareness, talking about the ummah, talking about Palestine and Islam, talking about colonialism, talking about imperialism, is important for us to continue that conversation, and important for us to continue the process of decolonization and liberation. You know more than me what works and what doesn't work in your region, but from my end, what's essential is the education of the centrality of the cause of Palestine, because of the reasons that I mentioned. It's not just from an Islamic perspective, but also from political and economic perspective. And again, Jazakumullah khair, everybody, for having me. And I'm sorry, I'm feeling under the weather. I was last week was very hard planning the march in DC. I lost my voice, as you see, and I barely get any sleep in the past week. So forgive me if I was not very clear about certain points, but it was really an honor being here and speaking to you and having this conversation. Sure. So I highly suggest Ilan Pape, the book Ilan Pape, The Ethnic Cleansing of Palestine. There's a book for Joseph Mas'ad. It's called The Persistence of the Palestinian Question. There's another book by Edward Said. It's called The Question of Palestine. It's also very, very important. Those three can give you a good starting point to understand the Palestine from different perspectives and different contexts. I think once you read these books, you have a better idea of what's happening, and then I think it becomes easier for you to pick which direction you want to go. But also another book I highly recommend. It's not about Palestine, but it's something to help you envision decolonization, is The Richard of the Earth by Frantz Fanon. It's very important for everybody, for all Muslims to read it. It's very, very important, to understand that book and go over it. And if you have any work, again, they're not about Palestine, but it's essential to understand decolonization. If you have any books about Ali Shariati, who's an Iranian thinker and intellectual, he's also very important. You should definitely read for him if you find anything in your language. I think there are very few books in English. I read most of his work in Arabic, but if you can find them in your language or in English, that'll be useful as well. But the first four books, three about Palestine directly and one about just colonialism and whatnot, is also important. If you want to spend to read more about settler colonialism, then start with The Colonizer and the Colonized by Albert Mimi. It's also a very important book as well to read on.